He built an empire, but couldn't rebuild his heart. 15 years ago. Jonathan Blake lost his wife in a tragic accident. What most people didn't know, he was the one behind the wheel. Since then, the Millionaire CEO buried himself in silence, routine, and success. No birthdays, no holidays, no one allowed close, until a new assistant named Emily walked in. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't try to change him. She simply stayed. And in doing so, she became the first crack in his perfectly built walls. Now imagine this. You've spent half your life punishing yourself for a moment you can't undo. And suddenly, someone shows up who sees the man beneath the guilt. Would you let them in or push them away again? This is a story about love, grief, and the quiet bravery of choosing to heal, even when you think it's too late. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Now, let's begin where his story almost ended. He built an empire, but locked his heart behind walls no one could enter, not even himself. It was always quiet at Jonathan Blake's house by the lake. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, more like a silence that settled too deeply into the walls, as if sound itself had learned not to linger. From the outside, the home looked like something out of a magazine, modern, sleek, expansive windows facing the water, surrounded by towering maples that now blazed with October gold. But inside, it was a study in stillness. No music, no photos on the walls, just curated spaces, pristine countertops, furniture that had never truly been sat in. Jonathan had lived there alone for over a decade, 15 years, to be exact. Each morning began the same way. He rose at 5:30, brewed a pot of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sat at the kitchen island to read the Wall Street Journal, even though he had already scanned the headlines online during the night. By 6:15, he was dressed in a crisp, charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, paired with the same navy tie he wore nearly every day. At 7, he arrived at the headquarters of Blake Care Health Solutions, the healthcare firm he'd built from nothing into one of the most respected in New England. Efficiency, discipline, predictability, they were his religion. But beneath that surface, beneath the accolades, the magazine covers, the executive awards, there was a hollow Jonathan never let anyone see. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. It was something quieter, heavier, like guilt wrapped in routine. He didn't speak of Margaret. No one dared to bring up her name, not even the few who had known her. She had died in a car crash at the age of 30. Back then, they had only been married 3 years. She'd been a teacher, the kind who wore scarves even in summer, who left notes in his lunch bag and danced barefoot in their tiny kitchen on Sunday mornings. Jonathan hadn't danced since. No one knew that he had been the one driving the car that night. They had argued about what? He barely remembered. Something stupid, something small. She'd reached to turn down the music, and he had looked away from the road for just a second, and that second had cost him everything. He'd survived with a fractured arm and a concussion. Margaret had died before the ambulance arrived, and while everyone called it a tragic accident, Jonathan never stopped believing it was his fault. He buried her on a cold November morning and built a different life after that one, where feelings were filed away like documents, where intimacy was replaced with meetings, where no one got close enough to leave. Over the years, he became known as brilliant but distant, courteous but unreachable. His executive team respected him, feared him even, but no one claimed to know him. Assistants came and went. Some lasted weeks, others months, but none made it past the invisible wall he kept around himself. And Jonathan preferred it that way. He didn't do small talk. He didn't attend company picnics or holiday parties. His name appeared on generous donation checks, but he never showed up for the photo ops. The people who worked under him were grateful for the jobs, the benefits, the ethical leadership, but they spoke of him like one might speak of a ghost. He went home every night to a house that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and cedar. He poured himself one glass of bourbon, never more, and stood by the window overlooking Lake Champlain, watching the sun set across the water without really seeing it. He lived, but he did not feel. That Friday morning, the phone on his desk buzzed at exactly 8:01. "Mr. Blake," came the clipped voice of his executive assistant, Mary Ann. "HR confirmed your new personal assistant starts Monday." Jonathan didn't look up from his screen. "Fine," he said. "She's highly recommended. Comes from a medical administration background. Managed a hospital department in Maine for 6 years. Her name is Emily Grant." Jonathan allowed a pause just long enough to show he had heard. "They all look good on paper," he replied. A brief silence. Then Mary Ann added, with only the faintest edge of sympathy, "Would you like to meet her before Monday? A short introduction? Maybe." He shook his head. "Unnecessary. She'll be reporting directly to your office." "I know the protocol," Jonathan said, a bit more sharply than intended. He exhaled. "That'll be all." As the line clicked off, he leaned back in his chair. Through the glass wall of his office, he could see the bustle of the corporate floor interns with coffee, analysts bent over spreadsheets, phones ringing. Life moved around him, but never through him. He opened his drawer and glanced, briefly, at the photograph tucked beneath a stack of documents. A black and white snapshot, slightly creased, of a woman with a scarf and a crooked smile. He closed the drawer again. Assistants came and went. They always did. And as far as Jonathan Blake was concerned, this new one would be no different. They never stayed past 3 months. She wasn't looking to change him, just to do her job. But her presence would change everything. The first morning, Emily Grant stepped into Blake Care headquarters. The Vermont sky was still dusted with late autumn mist. The parking lot glistened with dew. Her boots made soft sounds on the lobby's polished stone floor as she passed the front desk, coat draped neatly over one arm, a slim folder in the other. She didn't look like someone about to walk into the heart of one of the region's most powerful companies. But then again, Emily had long since stopped trying to look the part. At 32, she had learned that appearances rarely said anything true. Her long auburn hair was pulled back in a low knot, simple and practical. Her navy blazer fit well, but not tightly, and her black flats were scuffed just slightly at the toes. She wore no jewelry, no perfume, just a quiet presence and a faint scent of lavender soap. As she waited for the elevator, she glanced at her reflection in the brushed metal doors. Her green eyes looked steady, but beneath the calm was the same low flutter she always felt before starting something new. Behind that flutter, though, was something stronger resolve. Emily had not taken the job with illusions. She knew Blake Care's CEO had a reputation for being distant, demanding, and near impossible to work for. She'd heard the whispers during her final interview with HR, how assistants never lasted more than a season, how Mr. Blake avoided personal interaction like it might physically harm him. But she also knew how to navigate difficult people. Grief did strange things to people. So did guilt. She had seen both up close. Her mother had died slowly over 5 years, in and out of care homes, her once sharp memory dissolving like sugar in tea. Emily had been her sole caregiver, balancing hospital shifts with long nights by her bedside, and when her marriage fell apart in the middle of it all, she hadn't fallen apart with it. She just kept moving, one breath, one task, one gentle step forward. She had no interest in fixing anyone, especially not a man who didn't want to be fixed, but she knew how to stay calm in the storm, and sometimes that was all a job required. The elevator chimed softly as it opened on the 14th floor Jonathan Blake's floor. She stepped out, greeted by a hallway so still she instinctively lowered her steps. The carpet was thick, soundless. Frosted glass offices lined the hall, and at the very end was a larger door closed. A woman with silver blonde hair and sharp eyes greeted her before she could knock. "You must be Miss Grant," the woman said, with the tone of someone who'd seen dozens come and go. "I'm Mary Ann, Mr. Blake's executive assistant. He's expecting you." Emily smiled softly. "Thank you. It's nice to meet you." Mary Ann studied her for a beat longer than necessary, then gave a brief nod. "Good luck," she said, not unkindly. Then she stepped aside and disappeared into her own office. Emily took a breath, then gently knocked on the door. "Come in," came the voice, low, clear, clipped. She stepped inside and saw him for the first time. Jonathan Blake stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tablet. He didn't turn right away. She took in the crispness of his suit, the deliberate precision of his office, no clutter, no color, just function. "I'm Emily Grant," she said, steadying her voice. "Your new assistant." He turned then, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. His were cool gray blue, unreadable, not cruel, not unkind, just guarded, like someone always waiting for a door to slam shut. He gave a small nod. "I'm aware." A pause. "You can set your things at the desk outside," he added. "I don't require much beyond efficiency. No chatter, no meetings unless requested. You'll receive a task list each morning." Any questions? Emily shook her head. "No, sir." "Good." With that, he returned his gaze to the window. The conversation was over. Emily stepped out, quietly shutting the door behind her. That first day passed like water over stone. She learned the systems, sorted the calendar, reorganized files he hadn't touched in months. She listened more than she spoke, made notes in the margins, and noticed small things no one else seemed to. By lunchtime, she'd figured out that he took his coffee at precisely 10:45 but rarely drank more than half, that he disliked interruptions but appreciated summaries delivered clearly and concisely, and that he didn't acknowledge thank yous with words only a fractional tilt of the head. So the next morning, she made a choice. Instead of black coffee, she placed a mug of chamomile tea on his desk at 10:45. No sugar, just a slice of lemon and a tiny honey packet on the side. She didn't explain. She didn't hover. She simply placed it on the corner of the desk, near the tablet, then turned to leave. Jonathan didn't notice at first. He was reviewing notes, marking a file. But then, mid-sentence, he reached for the cup and paused. His fingers tightened slightly on the handle. He lifted the cup, took a sip, and stilled. A flicker, so brief most would miss it, crossed his face. Not recognition, not exactly pain, more like the sudden return of a scent long forgotten. Something buried under years of quiet. Margaret had loved chamomile tea. He hadn't tasted it since the funeral. He placed the cup down slowly. No words were exchanged, no questions asked. But when Emily returned at noon to deliver a folder, she noticed the teacup was empty, not untouched. And that evening, as he stood by his window watching the lake darken with dusk, he thought about the new assistant. She had begun like all the others, but something about her, even walls made of stone, began to shift with the right kind of silence. Jonathan Blake lived his life in rhythm. Not the joyful kind, like music or dance, but the kind that made time predictable, controlled, empty, but safe. He woke at 5 o'clock sharp. No snooze button, no delay. He brewed his coffee, though lately it sat untouched, and read the same 3 publications in the same order: the Journal, then Harvard Business Review, then the Blake Care Operations Report from the previous day. Breakfast was always the same 2 eggs, scrambled, toast with no butter. He never ate lunch before 1. His dinner was solitary and mechanical, usually grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, consumed at the same counter where no one else had ever sat. His suits were arranged by shade, his ties by stripe. He had not changed his cologne in over a decade. Jonathan would have told you he lived efficiently. But if you looked closely, if you dared, you might notice it wasn't efficiency. It was mourning, disguised in structure. Emily Grant noticed. She noticed without judging. By her second week, she had mapped the invisible routine. No one else had seen the way Jonathan avoided employee birthday lunches, how he preferred meetings before noon, how he seemed visibly tense whenever someone lingered at his office door too long. She noticed how he held his breath in elevators with more than 2 people. She noticed how he sat through board meetings like a statue, but glanced only once or twice toward the empty chair beside him at the long table. No one had ever sat there, but he always left it open. She didn't mention any of it. She simply worked quiet, competent, steady. And then came that Tuesday. The day had been relentless. 2 site inspections, a tense negotiation with a hospital board, back-to-back budget revisions. The staff was long gone by sunset, and even the soft footfalls of the janitorial crew had faded by 7:30. Emily stayed behind. Something in her told her to wait. She was finishing a project summary when she heard it. A dull sound like a dropped book. Then a thud. Then silence. She rose quickly and knocked once on his office door. No reply. She opened it. Jonathan was on the floor behind his desk, one hand braced on the carpet, the other clutching the side of the chair. His face was pale, lined with strain. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He didn't answer. His breath was shallow, eyes unfocused. She moved to his side without hesitation. Her medical admin background clicked in like a second skin check pulse. Check breath. No trauma. Just exhaustion. "Jonathan," she said, for the first time using his name. "You're okay. Just breathe. Slowly." To her surprise, he didn't flinch at her touch, didn't recoil or snap. She sat beside him, easing him back into a seated position. His shoulder rested lightly against hers, his head dipping forward, not from trust, perhaps, but because he had no strength left to resist. She reached behind her and pulled down the soft gray throw blanket from his coat rack, folded, unused, dustless, like a decoration more than a comfort. She draped it over his back, tucking it gently at the sides. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They sat like that, backs against the glass, the city lights of Burlington blinking below. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heating system and the slow, steadier rhythm of his breath. It could have been a moment. It became a turning point. Jonathan hadn't let anyone touch him in years, not even by accident, but he let her sit there. He let her stay. After a long while, he stirred. He shifted gently, just enough to sit upright. His expression was unreadable, something between confusion and weariness. "I'm fine," he said finally, voice hoarse. She didn't reply, just offered a small nod. He looked at her then, not quite meeting her eyes, but close. "Do you often stay this late?" he asked, almost awkwardly. "Only when it seems like someone might need help getting back up," she replied gently. A flicker of something passed over his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But not the usual nothing, either. He stood slowly. She helped him not overtly, not dramatically, just by holding steady while he regained balance. As she moved to leave, she glanced back once. "I'll update your schedule for tomorrow." I pushed the 8:00 to 9:00. He didn't argue. When she was gone, Jonathan remained standing in the center of the room. He looked down at the blanket now resting across the back of his chair. He thought of Margaret, of nights she'd waited up for him, tired but smiling, her favorite tea already steeped, her warmth waiting to meet his edges. He hadn't allowed anyone to get close since, and yet here was someone who hadn't tried to push, hadn't demanded entry, just sat beside him when his body betrayed him. He ran a hand across the back of his neck. The tension there had lived for 15 years. She didn't try to break my walls, he thought, walking toward the window. But somehow, she made me wonder if I still needed them. And for a man like Jonathan Blake, even wondering that was a crack. A quiet, human crack in the fortress he had built so carefully around his grief. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. The snow had started falling mid-afternoon soft at first, like the sky exhaling. By 5 o'clock, it had thickened into white silence. By 6, the roads were impassable. Jonathan had resisted the idea of staying. He hated disruption, even from weather. But as he stood at the window of his office, watching the snow swirl over the city, he knew there was no point in pretending. Emily was already checking road closures on her phone. She glanced up calmly. The department's advising against travel until morning. He didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded once and returned to his desk, loosening his tie. They weren't the only two left in the building, but the floor felt empty. Hollow in the way only a snowed-in building could be. Time slowed down. Conversations felt like echoes. "Do you want something warm?" Emily asked gently. "The break room still has a working microwave." He hesitated, then said, "There's soup in the staff fridge. Carrot ginger. I brought it this morning but forgot to eat." Emily smiled. "I'll heat it up." 20 minutes later. They sat together at the small meeting table near the west window. The snow kept falling, coating the city in a hush that felt more intimate than any words. Dinner was quiet. No small talk, no business, just soup and mismatched mugs. A shared loaf of bread she'd found in the staff pantry, and two people who had been alone for too long without realizing how heavy it had become. Afterward, she didn't leave. She sat across from him, the soft office light turning her hair the color of candle wax, her eyes calm and waiting but not expectant. Jonathan folded his hands on the table. His knuckles looked older in that light. His voice, when it came, was low. "I haven't told this to anyone." Not in full. Emily didn't nod, didn't lean in. She just breathed and let the silence hold. It was snowing that night, too. He began, not heavy, but steady. Margaret loved it. She always said Vermont winters were her favorite thing about marrying me. He paused, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the room, somewhere behind the years. We'd had an argument. I don't even remember what about. Something stupid, probably about how many hours I'd worked that week. She wanted to take a trip, just the two of us. I told her I couldn't step away, that I had too much riding on a board vote. A pause. Longer this time. I remember the look on her face when I said it. Not angry. Just tired. She went upstairs. I stayed in my office. Around midnight, I heard the garage door. Emily didn't move. She was going to her sister's place. Said she needed a night to clear her head. It was icy. I told her I'd drive her or call a car, but she insisted she'd be fine. He rubbed his face with both hands, then let them fall to the table, palms up, defeated. I followed her, took the back roads, caught up just outside the bend near the lake. The quiet deepened. She didn't see me coming. I just wanted her to pull over, to talk, but I flashed my headlights too late. She swerved. There was black ice. He swallowed. His voice cracked. The car flipped. I was the first to reach her. I held her hand until the ambulance came, but it was already too late. Silence. Just the sound of the heating unit humming gently in the corner. I told everyone she lost control. I told them it was just an accident. He looked up then. Not at Emily, but past her, like he still couldn't bear to see understanding in someone's eyes. But I caused it, not with cruelty, with pride, with silence, with every time I chose the company over her. And then it happened. His shoulders shook. His breath caught. For 15 years, Jonathan Blake had not wept. Not at the funeral. Not on anniversaries. Not when he closed the door to the bedroom they'd once shared and never opened it again. But now, in a snow-locked office with nothing but a mug and an empty chair between him and the truth. He did, not loud, not messy, just quiet, broken grief like a dam cracking softly at the seams. Emily didn't speak. She didn't reach for his hand or offer cliches. She just stayed. That was all he needed. Someone to sit still while the floodwaters rose. When the storm inside him began to settle, he looked down at the table, eyes red but clear. "I don't need forgiveness," he whispered. "Not really. No one can give me that but her. And she's gone." He looked at Emily now, meeting her gaze fully. "But maybe I need someone who doesn't walk away, even when I'm not ready to open the door." Emily's voice was soft. "Then I'll stay on the porch for as long as it takes." He gave a small breath of something between disbelief and gratitude. The kind of sound a man makes when he isn't sure if he's heard kindness or imagined it. The snow continued to fall outside. Quiet, patient. And for the first time in a long time, so did he. Healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's a cup of warm soup left on a cold night. After the night of the snowstorm, something began to shift. Not all at once, but gently like sunlight slowly soaking into frost-covered ground. Jonathan Blake was still the same man in most ways. He still arrived at the office before everyone else, still reviewed reports with military precision, still signed documents with that same sharp-angled signature. But to those paying attention, the silence around him felt different, less like distance, more like space. And it started, as healing often does, with something small. On Monday morning, a homemade blueberry muffin sat neatly on the edge of his desk, still warm, lightly wrapped in parchment. No note, but he knew. He glanced toward the outer office, where Emily sat tapping gently on her keyboard, face calm, unreadable. He didn't say a word, but later that day, as he sipped his tea in private, he realized something odd the muffin had made him feel, remembered. The next morning, the faint strains of classical music in the office had been replaced, not completely, just softened, shifted. A new playlist hummed gently in the background, instrumental folk, quiet piano, acoustic guitar. It wasn't intrusive, just warmer. At first, he almost turned it off, but then he didn't. On Wednesday, he left his office door slightly ajar, not by accident, a conscious decision. Just a few inches, but enough for light and voices to spill in. And then Friday came. They were reviewing the latest vendor proposal when Emily made an offhand comment about the company's mystical ability to delay delivery without ever technically being late. It was dry, subtle, delivered with a perfectly raised brow. And Jonathan Blake, who hadn't laughed in the office since most employees had started working there, let out a quiet, genuine chuckle. Emily looked up in surprise. So did he. He blinked, almost unsure of where the sound had come from, then cleared his throat and said simply, "That was funny." Just 3 words, but they landed like sunlight after a long season of gray. The staff started whispering. At first, it was cautious, like birds testing a thawing branch. "Did Mr. Blake actually say good morning today?" He helped me carry a box to the elevator. Voluntarily. I think he complimented someone's tie. I'm not even joking. Emily heard it all. But she didn't react. She hadn't come here to change him. She came to do her job. But deep down, she hoped something soft was growing in the quiet. That Friday afternoon, Jonathan did something she never expected. He paused at her desk, not with files or notes, but holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. "Chamomile," he said, placing one gently beside her keyboard. "You mentioned once it reminds you of your mother." Emily froze. Her fingers hovered above the keys. "You remembered that?" He nodded. "You said she used to make it for you when you couldn't sleep." For a moment, she couldn't speak. "My mom passed away 2 years ago this week," she said softly. "Pancreatic cancer. It was quick. Too quick. I barely had time to understand what was happening before she was gone." She lifted the mug, hand steady but heart shaking. The smell of chamomile reached her before the warmth of the cup did. It transported her. I was in Boston. She was here in Vermont. I drove all night. But I was too late. Jonathan didn't look away. He sat in the guest chair across from her desk, his first time ever doing so. "She was your anchor," he said, not as a question. Emily nodded. She had this way of making the world feel soft, even when it wasn't. He studied her for a moment, then asked quietly, "Is that why you came back here?" She hesitated, then said, "Yes. Boston held too many echoes. Here, at least, I could breathe again. Eventually." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, a reverent quiet. Then Jonathan surprised her again. "What happened? With your husband?" It wasn't prying. It was careful, considerate, like he wanted to know, not to fix. Emily exhaled slowly. "He was kind. We met young, stayed married through a lot, but grief doesn't treat people the same. After Mom died, I changed. I needed stillness. He needed motion. We kept missing each other." Jonathan listened, truly listened. "It wasn't ugly," she said, "just sad." We unraveled quietly, the way some things do. A long pause. Then Jonathan said something she never expected. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. For what? For the pain, for the way loss keeps echoing long after the room goes quiet. And in that moment, she saw it again, not the CEO, not the man in the perfectly pressed shirt, but the version of him who had once wept in silence over his own broken past. They sat like that for a while, sharing tea, sharing silence. And just before she turned back to her work, she said softly, "Sometimes the only thing we really need is to know someone's actually listening." He nodded once, as if that truth had never fully occurred to him. That evening, after he'd gone, she found a yellow post-it on her desk. It read, "The muffin helped. Thank you." No signature, but none was needed. Just when you start to hope again, fear whispers louder. The days after the snowstorm had brought something almost frightening peace. Jonathan found himself settling into a strange sort of rhythm with Emily. Their conversations, though still professional, carried warmth. There were pauses that weren't awkward anymore, silences that weren't tense. She had a way of softening the edges around him, and he, without realizing, had started letting her. It terrified him. The award ceremony loomed closer. Vermont Civic Hall had sent over the final program, and Blake Care's board was excited. Jonathan Blake, the elusive founder, the man behind decades of healthcare transformation, was finally being publicly honored. He didn't want the spotlight, but he knew what it meant for the company. And when it came time to write his speech, he asked Emily. Her eyes had lifted in surprise when he'd said it so plainly. "I'd like you to help me write it." He could have assigned it to the PR team or asked the communications director. But he didn't trust them to understand the tone he wanted. He trusted her. They spent several evenings together in the conference room, legal pads, tea, laptops, soft music in the background. Jonathan wasn't a man of many words, but with her, the words came easier. He admitted things he hadn't told anyone, that he hated public speaking, that he'd been avoiding award ceremonies for years, that the idea of standing on stage, being thanked, made his skin crawl. Emily listened, always without judgment. She took notes carefully, in handwriting that curled gently at the ends. Occasionally, she'd offer a suggestion, a phrase, or ask a quiet question that made him think. On the fourth night, the boardroom lights low, the heat humming softly from the vents, she said, "What if you mentioned Margaret?" His pen stopped moving. Emily didn't notice the way his back straightened. She kept talking soft, thoughtful. "Just a line or two," she said. The way she believed in this company before anyone else did. It would humanize the speech, show the heart behind everything you've built. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Emily finally looked up. He was staring at her, still, unblinking. "Jonathan." There was silence. Then, slowly, with an edge that cut clean through the air, he said, "Don't." Emily blinked. "I just thought don't touch that part of me." The words came low, but sharp. Her brows knit slightly. "I didn't mean to." "You don't get to mean," he said, rising from his chair. The scrape of wood on tile was loud in the quiet room. "I asked you to help with a speech," he continued, voice rising. "Not to mind my past like it's a story you're entitled to shape." Emily stood as well. "Jonathan, I wasn't mining. I was trying to help you connect," he said, with a bitter laugh. "You think mentioning Margaret in a speech will connect me to an audience? You don't even know what she meant to me." "I'm trying to know," Emily said, softer now. "You've let me in just a little." "And I thought that's the problem," he snapped. "You think this is something that because I've let you help write a speech or drink tea in the same room, we're close. We're not." The room fell cold. Emily didn't flinch, but her voice lost its steady anchor. "I never thought we were anything you didn't want us to be," she said. Jonathan turned away. He couldn't look at her face. It made something break open. "I don't want anyone attached to me, Emily," he muttered, "especially not you." Silence. Emily stood still for a long moment. Then she quietly closed her notebook. When she looked at him again, there was no anger, just something quieter, something cracked. "You don't have to push me away so hard," she said gently. "I was never trying to pull you anywhere you didn't want to go." She walked toward the door, every step quiet. Before leaving, she paused. Her hand on the knob, she said, "You're allowed to protect yourself, Jonathan, but don't pretend that keeping everyone out is the same as being whole." And then she was gone. He didn't move for a long time. That night, the lake was still. The snow reflected the full moon like polished glass. Jonathan sat by his fireplace in the house that had once been filled with Margaret's laughter and listened to the sound of nothing. The chair across from him sat empty. He'd always preferred it that way. Until now, and that more than anything terrified him. By dawn, he told himself it was better this way. Cleaner, safer. She'd be upset, sure, but she'd come back. They always did. But when he entered the office at 7:03 her desk was dark, no jacket, no tea, just an envelope. White, plain, folded once, He recognized her handwriting immediately. He carried it to his office, sat behind his desk, and opened it. No drama, no accusations, just a quiet, graceful resignation. One paragraph. A thank you. A goodbye. And at the bottom, her name in careful script. Emily Grant. Jonathan stared at the letter for a long time, and, for the first time in years, the silence in his office didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something had been torn away, and he wasn't sure how to put it back. The hardest goodbyes are the ones said in silence. The office was quiet that morning. Too quiet. No faint clicking of Emily's keyboard. No soft hum of music from her speakers. No tea on the corner of his desk. Just the white envelope. Still there, where it had waited all night. Jonathan stared at it for minutes, maybe longer. Part of him had hoped he'd imagined it, that she'd walk in, apologize for leaving in a rush, pick up her notepad and say, "Where were we?" But the silence around him made it clear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision. He finally opened the envelope. Inside, her handwriting was neat, calm, exactly like her. Mr. Blake, thank you for trusting me with parts of your world. That trust meant more than I can explain. But I've come to realize something staying in a place where I'm not wanted doesn't make me strong. It makes me small. I'm leaving not because I stopped caring, but because I started caring for myself. You once said silence was safety. I hope one day you'll find it can also be kindness. I'll still attend the ceremony tonight. After that, I'll be gone. Warmly, Emily Grant. Jonathan set the letter down, very slowly. It didn't burn his hands. It didn't shout at him. It didn't blame. And somehow, that made it worse. She hadn't tried to change him. She hadn't demanded closeness. She'd simply cared, and he'd pushed her out. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the lights overhead suddenly too loud. His chest felt tight, not from anger, from something else. Loss. Again. Except this time, it wasn't sudden or violent. It was quiet. Earned. Preventable. He opened his calendar, stared at the long row of scheduled meetings, and for the first time in years, hit cancel. Finance review, board prep, merger call, all gone. He needed space, not from others, but from himself. Outside, the lake was still half frozen. The edges had begun to thaw in the sun. A metaphor, he thought bitterly. One he was too late to live through. He walked slowly to the shelf behind his desk. On it sat a photo frame, long untouched. He picked it up. Margaret smiled back at him. Her face was soft, youthful, laughing at something just outside the frame. Her hair caught in the wind. The mountains behind her blurred. It had been their last trip before the accident. He hadn't looked at this photo in over a decade. He touched the edge of the glass, the pad of his thumb brushing the corner. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words fell so quietly. He wasn't sure he'd spoken them aloud. "I'm sorry for driving that night. I'm sorry for pushing you to meet that deadline. I'm sorry I didn't say I love you before we left the cabin. I'm sorry I let the grief turn me into someone even I can't stand." He hadn't meant to say all that, but once it started, he couldn't stop. "And I'm sorry, Margaret, that I mistook memory for punishment, that I thought building walls around your name was the same as honoring it." He sat the frame down, slowly, carefully, like a fragile thing that still deserved to be held. His throat tightened, his eyes burned, but for the first time, he didn't fight it. Grief didn't shout, not anymore. It just echoed. And as it did, something else rose underneath, a whisper not of fear, but of clarity. He didn't return to the office that day. Instead, he went home, showered, changed into his suit early, sat in silence on the porch for hours. The sun dipped low behind the hills. The wind carried the faint sound of traffic from the town. And when it was time, he got in the car. The Civic Hall stood glowing under soft amber lights, the entrance buzzing with guests in coats and formal wear. Inside, people sipped wine, laughed, posed for photos beneath banners printed with the words, "Honoring Vision, Remembering Humanity." Emily arrived through a side door, unnoticed at first. Her black dress was simple, elegant, her auburn hair swept into a loose twist. She held a small note card in her hands, lips pressing silent rehearsals of the speech she'd been asked to deliver her speech. Jonathan's original slot had been reassigned. A quiet corner of the foundation had asked her to speak on what it meant to care for others, behind the scenes how unseen acts of compassion had shaped Blake Care. She said yes, weeks ago, back when it was just a job. Now, it felt like something else entirely. She adjusted the microphone, her eyes scanning the sea of people, and she began. Behind the crowd, a figure entered through the back doors, not rushing, not grand, but walking deliberately, steadily down the center aisle. Jonathan Blake. His suit was the same charcoal gray, but something in his posture had changed. The armor wasn't gone, but it no longer looked like it was holding him up. Emily didn't see him yet. She was reading a line she'd written weeks before. Sometimes. Healing doesn't happen in hospitals. Sometimes. It begins in the quiet company of someone who stays. Jonathan stopped at the edge of the stage. She looked up and finally saw him. Their eyes met. He didn't speak. Not yet. But in that moment, everything unsaid was heard. Sometimes, love arrives not with flowers, but with the courage to speak finally. Emily's voice trembled just slightly as she continued her speech on the softly lit stage. It wasn't fear. She had stood in front of audiences before, but this moment, this one felt different. She glanced briefly at the crowd, hundreds of faces watching, politely listening. But her heart wasn't in the words on the page. Her heart was somewhere else. Or rather, it was with someone else. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Someone who, until last night, had made it clear he didn't want her to be near him, not really. She took a breath, willing herself to push through. Just a few more lines. Just one final closing thought. Then the sound of a door. Not loud, but somehow it rang across the room. She paused. A ripple moved through the crowd as someone stepped through the back of the Civic Hall. The click of formal shoes against tile echoed in a way that made people turn. And there he was, Jonathan Blake, still in his signature charcoal gray suit, but this time no briefcase, no team, no agenda, just him. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his eyes locked not on the stage itself, but on her, on Emily. Emily stood frozen, her heart now pounding so hard she could barely hear the microphone feedback as it picked up her breathing. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man who had shut the world out, who had built his life on control, who had pushed her away when she'd gotten too close, was walking up to her. In front of everyone. Jonathan stopped at the foot of the stage. The coordinator, stunned, adjusted the second microphone instinctively. Emily stepped back, not in fear, but in disbelief. Jonathan's gaze swept briefly across the audience before returning to her. He took the mic with a steady, almost reverent touch. And then, softly, so softly, the walls finally came down. "I don't make speeches," he began, his voice quieter than hers had been moments before, yet somehow more commanding. "For the past 15 years, I've avoided this exact moment, this kind of stage, this kind of honesty." People shifted in their seats. After my wife died, I buried myself in work. Not to honor her. Not really. I told myself I was continuing what we had started together. But in truth, I was running. I ran into meetings, into mergers, into silence. I learned how to make people respect me, but not how to let anyone love me. He looked at Emily, then really looked. Then someone walked into my office, uninvited, unapologetic, and entirely too patient. A few chuckles rippled gently through the room. She didn't try to fix me or pull me out. She just stayed, even when I didn't deserve it. And when she finally left, when she finally put herself first, I thought I'd be relieved. But I wasn't. He exhaled, voice trembling slightly now. I was devastated, not because I lost an assistant, but because I lost the only person who ever saw me for who I really am, and still showed up every morning with tea and kindness and questions I didn't know how to answer. The crowd had gone utterly still. She didn't ask for a promise. She never asked for more than what I was able to give, but the truth is, I wanted to give her everything. I just didn't know how. He turned fully toward Emily. She stood, frozen tears pooling quietly in the corners of her eyes. I don't have a speech for tonight, he said, lowering the microphone slightly. I only have a choice. And then he did something no one in the room expected. He set the microphone down on the podium and held out his hand, palm open, waiting. The kind of gesture that carries weight not because of what is said, but because of what is risked. I choose to stay, he said softly, no longer needing amplification. Not because I've figured it all out, but because for the first time in my life, I want to learn. With someone, I choose you, Emily, if I'm not too late. The silence was unbearable, and yet no one moved, no one coughed, no one blinked. They were witnessing something more intimate than romance, something more human than confession. They were witnessing a man tear down every wall he had ever built, in public. Emily stared at him, this man flawed, afraid, but finally open. She looked at his hand, then at his eyes, and without a word, without ceremony, she stepped forward and placed her hand in his. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, but she smiled. Not big, not theatrical, just enough for him to see she understood, that she wasn't promising forever, but she wasn't leaving either. The audience rose in a quiet standing ovation, not loud, not explosive, just sincere. Jonathan and Emily stood together, fingers entwined, like two people who had spent too long in winter and had finally stepped into spring. The best kind of love doesn't demand, it invites. 3 months had passed. Winter had folded itself away slowly, like a heavy coat returned to the closet for another year. In its place, spring had come not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. Vermont, always honest in its seasons, now wore its soft greens and muddy paths with grace. The lake behind Jonathan's home rippled gently under the late April breeze. Birds were back. The air no longer bit the skin, it kissed it. And in this new season, Emily came back. Not as a visitor, not as an employee, not even as someone seeking closure. She returned as a partner. Margaret House, the long-planned community health center, had finally been approved. The town council had embraced the idea, especially after Jonathan's public appearance, something they never thought they'd witness. The name had been Emily's suggestion. Jonathan didn't argue. He simply nodded, with the kind of quiet gratitude that needed no words. The center wasn't just a tribute. It was a beginning. Emily took up her role as co-director with a calm strength. She handled volunteers, met with nurses, juggled local budgets, all while navigating the gentle, cautious rhythm of something tender beginning between her and Jonathan. They didn't define it. They didn't label it. They simply allowed it. Because the best kind of love doesn't demand. It invites. Jonathan had changed, not in grand sweeping ways. He still drank his tea at precisely 6:30 a.m., still arranged his bookshelf alphabetically, still preferred silence after 9 p.m. But now, that silence was shared. Some nights. Emily sat by the fireplace reading while Jonathan sat beside her, each in their own book, their own thoughts, but aware of the warmth between them like a small lamp glowing steadily through fog. There were no declarations, no confessions, just the comfort of two people learning to exist near one another honestly, without pretending the past hadn't shaped them. One Saturday evening, with the sun dipping low behind the lake, Jonathan did something unusual. He cooked dinner. Emily had returned from a long day of interviews for the clinic's new family therapist. Her shoulders ached. Her shoes were covered in dust. But when she opened the front door, she paused. There was no takeout box on the counter, no tray of cold sandwiches hastily arranged by his assistant. Instead, the smell of garlic and rosemary filled the house. She stepped into the kitchen. Jonathan stood over the stove, sleeves rolled up, hair a little messier than usual. A cast-iron skillet hissed with seared vegetables. A simple roast rested on the counter, steaming gently beside a small pot of mashed potatoes. He turned toward her, clearly nervous. "It's not fancy," he said, almost apologetic, "but I figured I should learn how to feed the people I care about." Emily's throat caught. It wasn't the meal. It wasn't even the gesture. It was the realization. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to care for her in his own imperfect way. They ate together at the small table by the window, their laughter light, conversation slow. She watched him fumble with the wine cork, spill a few drops, curse softly under his breath, then glance up, sheepish. She smiled. He doesn't need someone to fix him, she thought. He just needs someone to stay, to love him not as a damaged soul, but as a whole person who had once been broken. And that's what she would give him. Not devotion rooted in guilt, not affection meant to fill voids, just love, quiet, steady, real. After they cleared the dishes and she wiped the counters clean, Jonathan disappeared into the study. She thought he was getting more files to review, like he often did, but instead, he returned holding a small, worn wooden box. It looked old, weathered around the edges, the brass hinges slightly loose. He didn't say anything as he set it on the table in front of her. He simply sat across from her and nudged it gently forward. Emily looked up. Jonathan's expression was unreadable, but not closed. Slowly, she opened the box. Inside was a single silver key, and beneath it a small slip of parchment paper. Familiar handwriting. Steady. Hers. You once said you had to leave, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring for yourself. So I'm asking, would you consider building something for both of us this time? No more leaving, just staying. Together. Emily lifted the key slowly, heart pounding with something between wonder and tenderness. "This is," she began. Jonathan nodded. "It's not just a house, it's ours. If you want it to be, no pressure, no expectation, just an invitation. The best kind of love doesn't demand, it invites." That night, long after the stars had arrived and the house had gone still, Emily stood on the porch of the lake house, the wooden box cradled in her arms. She wasn't thinking about the years behind her, only the ones ahead. And for the first time in a long, long while, she felt safe, dreaming again. Love doesn't erase the past. it helps you carry it differently. The first thing you noticed that morning was the wind. Not harsh, not biting like it had been for months, but softer, as if spring had finally decided Vermont had suffered enough. Outside, the town of Shelburne stirred with a quiet anticipation. Children in light jackets ran across the park. Flags fluttered from porch railings. On Maple Avenue, a small crowd gathered in front of a modest wooden building painted pale yellow, with wide windows and flower boxes already showing the brave green of new leaves. Over the entrance, carved into a hand-polished wooden beam, were the words, "Margaret House, for healing, for all." There were no press cameras, no corporate banners, just people. People who remembered what it felt like to be sick and afraid and alone. People who had lost someone, or almost lost themselves. People who believed in second chances. And there, standing beside the entrance in a dark navy coat, was Jonathan Blake. He looked older than the photos in the newspapers, softer around the eyes, not broken, just finally real. Beside him stood Emily. She wore no makeup. Her auburn hair danced gently in the breeze. One gloved hand held a clipboard. The other rested lightly by her side. They weren't holding hands. Not yet. But the space between them, once filled with silence and fear, was now filled with quiet, steady trust. When the mayor stepped forward to speak, the crowd hushed. "Today," he began, "we open not just a building, but a promise. A place where no one has to walk through illness or loss alone again. Thanks to Mr. Blake and thanks to Miss Grant, we now have Margaret House." He gestured toward the scissors on a velvet cushion, but Jonathan raised one hand. He stepped forward, eyes sweeping the crowd not to impress, but to connect. 15 years ago, he said, voice low but steady, I lost the person I thought I couldn't live without. And for a long time, I made sure I didn't live not really. I built walls. I built a company. I told myself it was enough. He turned slightly, looked toward Emily, just for a moment. But pain doesn't disappear just because you get busy. Grief doesn't go away because you ignore it. This place, this house is named for my wife, Margaret. But it was built because someone reminded me that life still has room for warmth, for light, for healing. A long pause. To the people who show up for others, quietly, daily, without asking for anything in return, you're the reason this house exists. Then he reached for Emily's hand. She didn't hesitate. Together, they cut the ribbon, and, for a brief, beautiful moment, the only sound was wind in the trees and applause that felt less like celebration and more like blessing. Inside the building, light flooded through the windows. There were soft chairs in the waiting room, a corner for children to read, and a small hallway that led to exam rooms painted in calming tones. No sharp fluorescent lights, no sterile metal cabinets, just warmth. Jonathan wandered through the space slowly after the crowd dispersed. He paused before a framed photo near the reception desk. It showed Margaret in her early 30s, laughing beside a wooden canoe, wind in her hair. His fingers touched the edge of the frame. I never knew how to carry you, he whispered, voice catching. So I tried to carry nothing. He closed his eyes, but she helped me. Emily helped me carry you in a way that didn't break me. Thank you for letting her find me. He stood still for a long time, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel torn between the past and present. He just was. That night, the lake house glowed like a lantern in the trees. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted apples. A record spun slowly in the corner, an old jazz album Margaret had loved, now reintroduced by Emily. Jonathan stirred 2 mugs of tea in silence. Emily sat at the kitchen table, reviewing tomorrow's staff schedules, glasses sliding down her nose. Her sweater was too big. One of his outside. Snow had begun to fall again, late spring's last surprise. Not a storm, just flurries. Gentle, like a memory returning without pain. He placed a mug beside her. Chamomile. With honey. She looked up, smiled. Perfect. They didn't talk much that evening. They didn't need to. After the dishes were done and the fire was lit, they settled onto the couch together. Jonathan pulled the knitted blanket over their legs. Emily leaned into his side, her head resting just under his chin. Through the wide living room window, snowflakes danced against the glass. He felt her hand slip into his. And for once, he didn't wonder if he deserved this peace. He just received it. "I used to think the best part of life ended with Margaret," he said softly. "But I was wrong." Emily didn't answer. She just listened. "Love doesn't come to erase what came before," he said. "It just gives you someone to carry it with." A log popped in the fire. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, they sat still, not waiting for anything, not holding back. And as Jonathan looked around the soft light, the worn books, the warmth, he realized something. This wasn't the house grief built. This was the house hope built. And he had chosen to live in it. "Turns out," he whispered, more to himself than anyone, "it wasn't too late after all." Sometimes the most difficult person to forgive is ourselves. Jonathan's story isn't just about grief or romance. It's about what happens when we carry guilt so long. It becomes part of who we are, when we confuse survival with living. When we believe that shutting people out will keep us safe, only to find it leaves us lonelier than ever. But healing doesn't need grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with small things like a cup of tea, a warm silence, or someone simply choosing to stay. This story reminds us that it's never too late to open your heart again, no matter your age, no matter your regrets. Even after years of darkness, light can still find its way in, often through someone kind enough to walk beside you without rushing you forward. And if you built walls to protect yourself, maybe that was necessary for a time. But you don't have to live behind them forever. Let this be a quiet encouragement. You are not beyond healing. You are not too late for love. You are still allowed to hope for connection, for peace, for joy, even now. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we'd be so grateful if you could like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that heal, uplift, and remind us we're never too old for hope. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, take care of your heart.